Welcome to AUSA's Army Matters podcast. This is Thought Leaders with Joe Craig. My guest today is L. Scout Lingamfelter. He's the author of Desert Redleg, Artillery Warfare in the First Gulf War. Colonel Lingamfelter began his 28-year career in the U.S. Army as a field artilleryman, moving up the ranks to colonel. He served in the Virginia House of Delegates from 2002 to 2018, and his work has been published in the Richmond Times-Dispatch and the Washington Times. Scott, welcome to the podcast.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
So, just to set the stage for our listeners, going back to the First Gulf War, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in August of 1990. And a few months later, you deployed to Saudi Arabia with the Big Red One, serving as executive officer for Division Artillery. You almost went to war at the side of Stormy Norman, General Schwarzkopf. What was the story there?
Well, actually, when I was at the Armed Forces Staff College, before I actually reported to the 1st Infantry Division, actually before I even knew, Joe, that I was going to be assigned to the 1st Infantry Division, my branch detailer called me and said, would you be interested in being an aide-de-camp to a 4-star general? And I said, well, I'd be interested in knowing more about it. So I was sent up to Washington, D.C., where I interviewed with then Lieutenant General Norman Schwarzkopf, who was acting as the Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations for the Army. And he was soon to be deployed to take over the Central Command in Tampa, Florida, which had oversight of all the Middle East and South Asia. And he was looking for a combat arms officer, a field grade officer, I was a major at the time, who had combat arms experience, but also had a background in the Middle East. And of course, my alternate specialty, beyond being an artilleryman, was that of a Middle East foreign area officer. In fact, my area of concentration was Iran, Iraq. And General Schwarzkopf's father was actually in Iran back when the Shah was in charge of Iran, decades ago. And so we had a very interesting conversation. He asked me if I wanted the job. I told him I'd be happy to serve as his aide-de-camp. He said, okay, you have the job. I went back to the Armed Forces Staff College, and a week later they called me and said the general is being activated early to take over CENTCOM. He's going to the Middle East, and he needs his aide-de-camp to come with him. So I was very excited about escaping academia, Joe, and I went to the commandant at the Armed Forces Staff College, who promptly said, I'm sorry, if you leave, you won't graduate. So unfortunately, they wouldn't let me go early with General Schwarzkopf, and he had to pick another person down on his list to be his aide-de-camp. After that, very fortuitously, my duty assignments officer, Colonel Joe Monco, who was very much a mentor of mine throughout my career, had me assigned to the 1st Infantry Division Artillery. And I got to tell you, Joe, never in my wildest dreams have I ever had such a fortuitous turn of events, because I wound up participating in the Gulf War with what I personally believe was the finest division in the U.S. Army.
Yeah, they certainly played a huge role in the conflict, as we'll discuss over the course of the podcast here. You mentioned that you had some Middle East training, and that actually came into play before the division went overseas. There was a moment you talked about where the commander, who was then Major General Thomas Rame, asked for your assessment of the situation. So what exactly did you tell him at the time?
Well, that was a fascinating turn of events. At the time, I was a DuVardy XO. I was not part of the division intelligence structure that did battlefield intelligence and so on and so forth. But a weekend prior to this meeting that I wound up, this sort of happenstance meeting I had with General Rame about what was getting ready to happen in the Persian Gulf, we were having a neighborhood party among some of my friends and their wives and our kids all running around, having a good old time. And we got to talking about what was going on in the Middle East. And in the process of that, I had shared that I had been in the Defense Intelligence Agency as the Iran-Iraq War analyst from about 82 to 85, where I looked at the Iran-Iraq War very closely and really gained some real insight on how the Iraqis fight. And so we just got to chatting and so on and so forth. And as I relate in the book, the following Monday, I was up at my headquarters, and I got a call from one of my neighbors who was at the party who said, hey, General Rame's coming to the headquarters. I hope you don't mind. I told him you were a Middle East expert. He wants to talk to you. He hung up the phone, and then so I walked into my boss's office. I said, I think I've gotten us into trouble. So then shortly thereafter, yeah, that's right. So General Rame came marching into the headquarters, looked at me and said, oh, old Middle East guy, I see. So then he brought me in asked me a bunch of questions about how the Iraqis would fight. I did my best to try to share with him how I thought they would fight, that our tactics were superior to theirs, that we would defeat them, I thought, because of our air-land battle skills, which was the effective use of ground maneuver and fire support from the artillery and from attack helicopters and the Air Force, that the Iraqis were not very good at maneuver, but they did follow Russian tactics, and they did have Russian equipment. So in a sense, the army, Joe, that was sent out there to fight the Iraqis was one that had become well-versed in how to fight the Russians on the northern plains of Germany. And so I told General Raim I thought that we would be victorious. What I couldn't say for sure is whether or not Saddam Hussein would resort to things like weapons of mass destruction, chemicals primarily, and in which case we might well take some very significant casualties on the battlefield. I remember he asked me, he said, what do you think my biggest challenge will be? And I said, POWs. I think POWs are going to be a big challenge. And as it turned out, we captured thousands of them, and it was difficult to handle that.
But you did eventually make it out into the field, or the desert, we should say. The air war is starting, and then got the days leading up to the ground assault. What was artillery doing at that period of time?
When General Schwarzkopf came up with this big left hook that he was going to throw at the Iraqis by sending the 7th Corps, of which the 1st ID was a part, well out into the desert. Initially, when we got out there in our initial tactical assembly area, we organized for combat, we trained, we uploaded ammunition, we rehearsed different combat scenarios, both at the individual level and at the unit level. And then eventually the artillery in early February, the first 2 weeks or so of February, we began to redeploy to forward positions out in the desert before the ground war actually began. And so when we got out there, the decision was made by my boss and others that we would conduct field artillery raids on the infantry division, the 26th Infantry Division opposite the 1st Infantry Division, in advance of the division actually making a breach into that enemy defense. In other words, we're going to use the artillery effectively to pound the enemy into submission and destroy as much of the force as we could over many days before committing our ground troops to go into battle with the Iraqis. And so for 8 days, beginning around the 16th of February, right on up to the 24th of February, when we actually made that ground assault, when we broke a hole in the Iraqi lines for 7th Corps divisions to flow through and attack deeper into Iraq. For 8 days, we fired almost 10,000 rounds of artillery and close to 2,000 rockets at these positions, these Iraqi 26th Infantry Division soldiers, and just basically decimated them. And as a result, when the division went through the breach, we made quick order of the 26th Infantry Division. In fact, we were so effective in those 8 days that the actual ground assault was moved up one day because we had, in fact, reduced so many of them. And, Joe, that's one of the reasons I wrote this book, is quite frankly, this scenario, this notion that you read about, that this was a 100-hour war, that was tanks and Bradley infantry fighting vehicles dashing across the desert, the Air Force going deep, boom, it was over in 100 hours. Nothing could be further from the truth. And that is why we wrote this book, particularly the role of the field artillery, which has always been the king of battle. It's always had a decisive impact in warfare, and it did in this war as well.
Right. So you're talking about the king of battle, as you say, pounding the Iraqis, terrible time to be one of them, facing this kind of onslaught, and then maneuver forces, punch the hole, and go through the breach. Division artillery then had a follow-on mission after the breach. So how exactly did the artillery fight a running battle and avoid friendly fire accidents?
Well, fortunately, we were able to take down their counterfire capability, the Iraqi counterfire capability, very early in the process. We destroyed their ability to shoot back at us like we could shoot back at them. The second piece is, after our initial artillery attacks, the Iraqis, I think, figured out pretty quickly that if they shot at us, we would have rounds on them within minutes before they could move out of the way. And so to a certain extent, our power and our effectiveness at counterfire on our side of the ledger was extraordinarily helpful in deterring them from shooting. I mean, they did shoot at us. I mean, primarily illumination rounds at night to try to detect our movements. But they figured out pretty quickly that if they shot at us, we would shoot back and blow them up pretty effectively. My guess is, looking back on it, that the Iraqis decided that they would wait before they would commit their major combat forces until an actual ground assault began. So I think the artillery raids really caught them off guard. And I don't think they were expecting, 8 continuous days of getting pounded silly. They thought we'd just come blasting through, and at that time they would fire their initial preparation themselves, their initial defensive fires. But that did not materialize because I think we effectively destroyed their capability to do that, which was our intent.
Yeah, and you make vivid examples of how the Iraqi defenses were crumbling during this onslaught. You got hundreds of Iraqi soldiers surrendering, and you had an interesting way of dealing with the POWs. Can you share how you managed them?
Yeah, it was, we just were really unprepared. And as I remember talking to Tom in the office up at our headquarters when he came to quiz me about how the Iraqis would fight based on my background as an Iran-Iraq war analyst. And I told him, I said, there would be lots of prisoners. And we had seen that in the Iran-Iraq war, that if you punch the Iraqis hard in the nose, many of them will surrender. Their officers will abandon them, just like they did with the Iranians in some cases. And you will have a huge POW problem to deal with. To the best of my memory, what happened was the division designated some POW holding positions, as well as the 7th Corps did for all the divisions. And we had to direct that the Iraqis head south. And once they began to give up in droves, they were very ragtag, very hungry, very worn out. Many of them, their clothes were rotting off their back. I mean, they had not been taken well care of by their leadership. So many of them were quite ready to surrender in the 26th Infantry Division because we had just pounded them so badly. And so what we were able to do was basically line them up, take their weapons from them, destroy their weapons, and then sort of direct them in a single file to head south. We'd point in that direction, and the word got around that we would use the name of our division support command, Colonel Bob Shadley, who's just a marvelous logistician. I mean, just a wonderful guy and a great warrior. And so the troops began to say to the Iraqis, Shadley, and point south. And all the Iraqis would say back, Shadley. So they finally got the message that if they went south, they would at least not get killed, that we would handle them in a just manner. So I had to laugh that I think that the one word that the Iraqis mastered in those hours after we had made the initial assault into Iraq was the word Shadley. I mean, they figured out pretty quickly that meant head south, behave, don't cause any trouble, and you won't be killed.
Yeah, invoking the magic word there.
It was the magic word.
So by the time the fighting came to an end, 1st Division and Tavardi had amassed a pretty impressive record. Then, interestingly, they also played a part in making the peace during the negotiations. Can you tell us about that?
We began to settle in for an occupation of northern Kuwait to pacify the situation there, only to almost immediately get orders from General Schwarzkopf that we needed to get up to Safwan Air Base, which was a large airfield that had been constructed in southern Iraq for strategic purposes. As I recall, the Soviets actually participated in building that thing. But General Schwarzkopf wanted his forces to occupy that airfield because he thought it was very important, Joe, to have the Iraqis surrender to us on Iraqi territory, because then it would be unambiguous that they had been vanquished and that we were the victors, that the coalition was the victors. But we had a little problem. We thought that Safwan was in U.S. hands and coalition hands, and it wasn't. There was still an Iraqi tank brigade sitting on it. So in the initial hours of the 1st of March, the day after we got into Kuwait, we had been given a mission by General Schwarzkopf to get up to Safwan and secure it for the peace operation. That meant we had to push the Iraqis off of that airfield. And it was a rather interesting battle. I write about it in the book. People can read about it in the book. But eventually, we were able to overcome that problem. And the 1st Division set up the surrender site, essentially, on that airfield and secured it for the Iraqis to come in and sit down across from General Schwarzkopf and basically agreed to the terms that we had projected in front of them. And there wasn't a lot of negotiation. It's probably wrong to call it a negotiation. It was a directive. You will do this. And it took a couple hours to get it all done, but the 1st Division was key in setting up that surrender site. And I thought it was ironic that there I was as an eyewitness to this whole thing. And here's General Schwarzkopf walking past me to the tent, and I thought to myself, I just can't believe how close I was to being his aide-de-camp. But I was ultimately happier that I was in the 1st Infantry Division, much happier.
And then you guys had a couple more months in country, but then when it finally comes time for the division to go home, you end up being the last one to leave. Can you tell us why that was?
Yeah, I thought I was being punished. Actually, I had been the XO of the division artillery, and so I expected, just like anybody organic to a division brigade structure, that when it was time for us to go home, I would go home with the artillery. Well, what I didn't know is that Tom Rame, who was our division commander, and just really, I just can't say enough about the guy. He's just a marvelous man, and he was a tremendous leader, very sagacious, very prescient. He understood what he was faced with from day one in this Gulf War peace, and just doggedly pursued the right solutions for the problems that we confronted. Unfortunately for me, he had watched my performance and decided that I needed to stay behind and command the redeployment force and get the division home.
So in the book, you obviously make the case for the important role of artillery in the Gulf War that has been dominated in history telling by the air war and a little bit by armor. What do you take from that experience, and what do you see for the king of battle in future conflicts?
The things that we learned are that if you bring a unit together, an artillery force, like we had under us in the Big Red One, the command and control challenges are huge. Let me give you an example. Normally, a DIVARTY is about 3 battalions and a couple of rocket batteries and some target acquisition batteries. And in most war games that I participated in prior to the Gulf War, maybe we would have 3, 4, at the max, maybe 5 reinforcing battalions from other artillery-type units, FA brigades, field artillery brigades, that would reinforce us in a scenario. Not so in Desert Storm. In Desert Storm, Joe, we had 17 artillery battalions. It was huge. It was absolutely huge. I mean, we fired almost 10,000 rounds in just 8 days and 2,000 rockets. And it was really a remarkable performance, in particular by Lieutenant General, then Colonel, but Lieutenant General Mike Dodson. And the DIVARTY staff that worked for him, of which I was sort of the chief of staff, I think did a remarkable job in putting together the structure and the ability for us to control so many battalions effectively as we did throughout these raids. I mean, it was just unbelievable. And so one of the things that we took away from the Gulf War was you really need to practice these relationships more in peacetime so that you have a better understanding about not only how difficult it is to plan the fires of so many units, and it can be done. We did it. We proved we could do it. But also, how do you manage the logistics of what is almost a force as big as the division itself when it was at its apex? And so we learned a lot there. We learned a lot about fire support coordination measures, how you keep from blowing up other people by mistake, particularly your friends, your people, your troops. The Army has made tremendous strides and is making tremendous strides in improving not only the lethality of the munitions that we will use on future enemies, but the just unbelievably extended and long ranges that we will be able to fire with hypersonic and improved ballistics and longer cannon tubes, these things will once again ensure that the artillery will be known as the king of battle. I'll just say this. During the insurgency years, and I write about this in the book, quite frankly, the Army let the field artillery atrophy a bit because it wasn't quite as utilized in door-to-door insurgency operations as it will be when we fight more conventionally configured battles in the future. And so the Army right now needs to make a significant investment of time and energy to ensuring that all the elements of combat power, in particular the field artillery, the incredibly valid and historic destructive power of the field artillery, to make sure that that is synchronized into other elements of combat power so that we literally overwhelm our future enemies in the same way that we overwhelmed the Iraqi 26th Infantry and Republican Guards who had the misfortune of standing between us and the liberation of the Kuwaiti people.
Certainly, as the Army is prioritizing long-range fires, modernization efforts, and as the nation changes focus in the future to near-peer conflict, your lessons learned from this book are certainly going to be very instructive. So I really want to thank you for being our guest tonight.
Well, thank you so much.
So again, thanks to L. Scott Lingamfelter for being a guest on Army Matters. And his new book again is Desert Redleg, Artillery Warfare in the First Gulf War.
To all our listeners, thanks for joining us. Be sure to subscribe to the Army Matters podcast on iTunes and everywhere podcasts are found. The Army Matters podcast series is brought to you by the Association of the United States Army, the U.S. Army's professional association, member-supported, Army-connected. Visit us at AUSA.org for more information or to become a member. Your membership helps AUSA continue to carry out its mission to educate, inform, and connect with the total Army, our industry partners, and our supporters of a strong national defense. For questions or to provide topic recommendations, email us at podcast@ausa.org. Have a great Army Day. Hua.